people who prayed to a different god or wanted to do their own thing or express their own personal freedom, or who even wanted to protect the environment were told to stay silent. For people who were anything outside the mainstream, it was an uncomfortable terrain. Conformity was a very, very, very powerful force in life in the 1950s.
Raised to think for ourselves by our parents and to question authority more than any previous generation, we suddenly looked around and began to notice terrible hypocrisies and injustices.
Morning, dear.
All these shows about families that could have been yours, except you weren't them, they weren't you. You never saw yourself there, except as a maid or a janitor or some person doing menial work. So you liked it, and it repulsed you at the same time.
Hi, dear. Hello, Oreo.
Television created a kind of aspiration of what could be. It gave you pictures of a world that you could live in.
The Henderson's residence.
So this medium did an enormous job in both creating aspiration and demonstrating how far you were from that aspiration.
I remember the first time I saw a young black woman on television. It was Cab Calloway's daughter, and she was dancing. She was in a dance program on Ed Sullivan, I think, and everyone in the neighborhood went home to watch that show because it was such an unusual occurrence.
Just as many of us were becoming conscious of the contradictions in our society, a charismatic leader emerged who offered a fresh vision for our country.
Together, let us explore the stars, conquer the deserts, eradicate disease, tap the ocean depth, and encourage the arts and commerce.
I think that John Kennedy's call to action, his challenge, his inspiration, was enormously influential in kicking off the 60s and sort of opening the door to what followed.
For many of us, President John F. Kennedy represented a hope for a new and optimistic era. Raised to believe that we could pursue and achieve our own dreams, we saw the visionary Kennedy as an emblem of our idealism and our belief that with commitment and determination, we could shape a fantastic future.
This nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the earth.
Well, President Kennedy was the first politician that I got actively engaged in the campaign. I was a high school student, and what I was attracted to was how young and vibrant that he was. This amazing young man with this big vision.
The idealism of the boomers that led them to campaign for Kennedy also led many to volunteer for the Peace Corps that he initiated and join the battle for civil rights in the South. He inspired young Americans to make a difference with their lives. Along with President Kennedy, other charismatic leaders would emerge.
We will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last.
All of a sudden, the sit-ins came along, and you saw how you could join this fight. You didn't have to be a lawyer like Thurgood Marshall. You didn't have to be a magical speaker like Dr. King. If you could sit down, you could join this movement, and all of us can sit down. And the lunch counter sit-ins were victorious relatively quickly. In Greensboro, a matter of months after the sit-ins began, the lunch counters integrated.
I, as a Latino baby boomer, have benefited personally, and my community has benefited as a group because of what has happened with my generation. Things may not be perfect, but compared to what my parents and generation of parents who came from Mexico or Asia or other parts of the world, we now can grow up in this country knowing that we have far more opportunities to advance and to be what we want to be than our parents or grandparents before us.
The boomers helped eliminate racial segregation by law in this country. It is the people who gave life to an environmental movement that is still with us. These are the people who took an older Hispanic movement that was long-lasting, long existing in the United States, and gave it new impetus. It's not that the baby boomers invented these things, far from it, but they gave life to them. And because their numbers are so great, they made them a semi-permanent or permanent part of American life and culture.
From Dallas, Texas, the flash, apparently official, President Kennedy died at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time, 2 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, some 38 minutes ago.
Anybody here seen my old friend John? Can you tell me where he's gone? He freed a lot of people, but it seemed the good they die young. I just looked around and he's gone.
Each generation in this country appears to have a defining moment, which helps us to understand how they are as a group and how they differ from other generations. The defining moment for baby boomers, in my opinion, was the assassination of President Kennedy. Every one of us knows exactly where we were, how we felt, the moment we heard that President Kennedy was assassinated. That began our continual journey into skepticism, into frustration, into a lack of belief that government and society can do good and can be trusted. We are still living with that legacy.
Lee Harvey Oswald, 24, ex-Marine who once wanted to be a citizen of communist Russia.
There is Lee Oswald. He's been shot.
I think John F. Kennedy, and it's hard to say, benefited from dying young. And because he died young, without having completed his first term, you're able to impose on him what you thought he would have done. You thought he would have withdrawn from Vietnam. You thought he would have been more vigorous in pursuit of civil rights than he actually was. I don't want to denigrate him. He did some good things, but he didn't do what popular memory says he did.
We had a series of assassinations that I think left people feeling empty, and then you realized to a significant degree you couldn't depend upon the leaders who were out there to change the world. You had to rely upon yourself because they might disappear. You couldn't count on them being there.
I just want to do God's will. And He's allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land.
The assassinations of great leaders shaped me. They shaped me in ways I think I'm just beginning to understand.
But now it's on to Chicago and let's win there.
Senator Kennedy has been shot. Is that possible?
They made me appreciate the risk that some people are willing to take, knowingly.
Thought I saw him walking up over the hill. Abraham and Martin.
Their death has marked me. It has impressed me with how important it is to be guided by a moral vision.
The combination of those three powerful and charismatic men, cut down in their prime, had a profound impact on us. The official investigations that followed the assassinations were met with skepticism and distrust. It was a time of great anguish and disillusionment, especially for the young.
Turn on and drop out.
Throughout history, adolescence has always been a time of rebellion and challenging authority and finding your own voice. That was me. But when tens of millions of teenagers did it at the same time, it was called the 60s. The Beatles arrived in America when many of us were teenagers and looking for something new. And here they came in their suits and their strange mop-top hairdos. They didn't look anything like Elvis, Nat King Cole, or Pat Boone. But suddenly they were the rage. Everybody was playing the Beatles, and everybody was talking about them. What we also came to love about the Beatles, kind of what really blew our minds, was their fantastic capacity to change, to take risks, and transform themselves again and again and again. Just as Kennedy is an icon of boomer idealism, the Beatles are a personification of the boomers' eagerness to embrace change. Although amazingly, their recording career lasted less than a decade. Perhaps more than anywhere else, the boomers expressed their rebellion in their choice of music. Rather than being something to dance to or to set the mood for romance, the new music was about liberation and protest.
1, 2, 3, 4. Sha la 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 la, live for today. Sha la 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 la, live for today. And don't worry.
The 60s were a period of enormous social changes in America. One of the most profound was in sexual relationships. In 1960, the Food and Drug Administration licensed the birth control pill. The pill gave women a greater sense of sexual freedom than any other contraceptive device that had come before. It was an instant success.
I remember the fear of pregnancy when I was in high school. I remember the terror, the girls who vanished, who went to the wilds of New Jersey, and then were admitted to New York Hospital hemorrhaging. And some of them never returned. And some of them were sterilized for life.
I think the fact that women finally had reproductive rights, that we could protect ourselves, that we weren't going to get pregnant when we had sex, absolutely freed women to begin to experiment with sex. I'm so happy not only that I lived through it, but I survived, because there was a period right after where people didn't survive that kind of life style.
Yes, for a little while, people could hook up and fear no consequences. But that period when people were really free to hook up was maybe less than a decade. Because right after that, we got AIDS.
The introduction of birth control had prodigious consequences that I think we're just beginning to recognize. Because what it allowed for the first time was for people to engage in sex without it meaning that they were going to have children. And once that was true, then marriage and sex became uncoupled.
Like previous generations of youth, the boomers also experimented with drugs. But unlike earlier generations, they brought them from the margins of society into the mainstream.
One pill makes you strong.
There's no question that as boomers came to experiment with drugs like marijuana, that this was a chief reason they began to question authority, because the authorities were telling them that marijuana would kill you and lead to insanity and cause brain damage.
He is hopelessly and incurably insane, a condition caused by the drug marijuana to which he was addicted.
Shut up, shut up! The next tragedy may be that of your daughter, or your son, or yours, or yours, or yours.
You know, these were all fabricated stories or based on really shoddy research, and it wasn't very hard to see through them.
The ancient goals which we follow can be defined in modern terms, in the metaphors of the present, as turn on, tune in, and drop out.
As a parent of a young woman, or then a child, growing up in the 60s, I felt that the society was making my life difficult. When Time magazine glorified drug pushers on the jacket, on the front cover of the magazine, and I'm trying to get my kid to stay away from drugs, that's no great help to me as a parent.
There was something about going to the Fillmore East and watching Grace Slick and being stoned and just being high and exploring the expanse of those boundaries. That was amazing. That was amazing. Was it dangerous? Would I recommend it to children? No, I wouldn't. But do I regret it? No, not at all.
The one thing that we learned in the 60s is that there was a reason why certain values and institutions had persisted for thousands of years. The other thing we learned is we couldn't remake the world. As much as everybody wanted to remake a brand new world, we're going to remake values, we're going to start from the beginning. It doesn't work that way, and I think a lot of people learned that the hard way.
As movies of the era portrayed, in the 60s and 70s, sex, drugs, and rock and roll were part of the rebellion against all authority. We challenged everything, from polite middle-class conventions to the most basic rules of conduct. And we didn't just question rules that didn't make sense to us, we defied them. One of the best examples of this is this memorable scene from 5 Easy Pieces.
I'd like a plain omelet, no potatoes, tomatoes instead, a cup of coffee, and wheat toast.
No substitution.
What do you mean, you don't have any tomatoes?
Only what's on the menu. You can have a number 2, a plain omelet. It comes with cottage fries and rolls.
Yeah, I know what it comes with, but it's not what I want.
Well, I'll come back when you make up your mind.
Wait a minute. I have made up my mind. I'd like a plain omelet, no potatoes on the plate, a cup of coffee, and a side order of wheat toast.
I'm sorry, we don't have any side orders of toast. I'll give you an English muffin or a coffee roll.
What do you mean you don't make side orders of toast? You make sandwiches, don't you?
Would you like to talk to the manager? Hey, Mac.
Shut up. You've got bread and a toaster of some kind?
I don't make the rules.
Okay, I'll make it as easy for you as I can. I'd like an omelet, plain, and a chicken salad sandwich on wheat toast. No mayonnaise, no butter, no lettuce, and a cup of coffee.
A number 2, chicken salad sandwich. Hold the butter, the lettuce, the mayonnaise, and a cup of coffee. Anything else?
Yeah, now all you have to do is hold the chicken, bring me the toast, give me a check for the chicken salad sandwich, and you haven't broken any rules.
You want me to hold the chicken, huh?
I want you to hold it between your knees.
You see that sign, sir? Yes, you all have to leave. I'm not taking any more of your smartness and sarcasm.
You see this sign?
For better or worse, anti-authoritarianism is another of the major traits of our generation. Don't trust anyone over 30 became our mantra. That meant parents, teachers, politicians, and for many, those who had led us into Vietnam.
Our response will depend upon the action of the aggressors, in this case, the North Vietnamese.
Smartness and sarcasm.
You see this sign?
For better or worse, anti-authoritarianism is another of the major traits of our generation. Don't trust anyone over 30 became our mantra. That meant parents, teachers, politicians, and for many, those who had led us into Vietnam.
Our response will depend upon the action of the aggressors, in this case, the North Vietnamese.
Vietnam was never fully justified. It was never clear what our goals were. It was never clear if we had a strategy. And we were sending baby boomer after baby boomer after baby boomer to fight and possibly die for a war that ultimately turned out to be pointless and, from a political sense, duplicitous. I think the formative experience for boomers was a sense that America wasn't living up to its ideals. that there was something awry, that the people in power, the authorities, the leaders, they weren't telling us the entire truth, and something had to be done about it.
The draft was an awful spur to anti-war sentiment. As you can imagine, you're 18, 19 years old, the possibility of your being sent thousands of miles away to fight against an enemy who had never lifted a hand to you, that helped people propel themselves into the anti-war movement. The general feeling of rebellion that was in the air. If the government says do something, there must be something wrong with it.
This is the end, beautiful friend.
You know, you end up in Vietnam at that young age of your life. It opened my eyes to go to the bottom of the deck and see what's going on. I became another person over those 15 months. The country became so divided in Vietnam. It was like the American Civil War for me. And Platoon was based on that feeling of division in every unit I was in.
The Vietnam War put an axe right down the middle of this generation, the baby boom generation, because some people went and some people didn't, and the people who went will always resent those who didn't.
I shall not seek, and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president. People have got to know whether or not their president's a crook. Well, I'm not a crook.
The 1670s were a time that began to pull the country apart in terms of values. It opened up these great gaps between what people believe, so that you had these new values that were being embraced largely on the coast and largely in some of the Big Ten schools, versus the old traditional values. And we've seen this in our boomer presidents. You know, Bill Clinton represents the new values. George W. Bush represents the old values.
If we couldn't trust authorities, who could we trust? Raised from childhood to make our own choices, we decided to listen to our inner voices. Know yourself became the new mantra. Self-awareness, the goal.
I think that the surge of interest in self-development was a developmental necessity. It wasn't that it was because seminars were available or people were writing books. I think it's the other way around. That those did so well at the time because there was such a huge thirst, such a huge appetite. A natural corollary of self-awareness is when you see yourself, you see the good parts, you see the blemishes, and you want to do something about improving things.
The social upheaval of the decade created not only divisions in the country, but painful rifts within families, particularly between parents and children. We saw the beginnings of a troubling generation gap. By the mid-1970s, boomer men and women had forged a distinct generational identity. We've seen the development of the four most important characteristics: idealism, anti-authoritarianism, an eagerness to embrace change, and self-empowerment. We'll see how these personality traits will affect the boomers' careers, their marriages, and their parenting. And we'll also see how these traits will most likely shape the way we live our later years, who we become at 65, or even 100.
For a generation which had been coddled by their parents in childhood and supported by them despite their sometimes indiscriminate rebelliousness as teenagers, the unthinkable was about to happen. It was time to leave the sheltered havens of college campuses and get a job.
Changes. Don't wanna be a richer man.
Get a job. Between 1969 and 1976, some 8 million baby boomer graduates entered the labor force, twice the number who began working in the 7 previous years. Their anti-authoritarian style was about to change the workforce forever. To understand this next shift, it might be useful to have some historical perspective. America began as an agricultural society where grandfather, father, and son often plowed the same fields together. Women also helped in the fields, raised the kids, and of course managed all the tasks required to keep the household safe and secure. The Industrial Revolution created new kinds of work, best suited for the young and able-bodied. The farm-based family split up. Men went to work in the mills and the factories, and the women remained at home to look after the kids. But slowly, the manufacturing society gave way to a white-collar world. Corporations replaced factories as the center of work in America. Employees spent their entire career working for the same company, and loyalty was a two-way street.
This truly wonderful gift will be a constant reminder of your friendship and the help you've given me.
But idealistic boomers weren't brought up to be the same company men that their fathers had been. They wanted more from their work than a salary and security. We wanted our jobs to provide opportunities for personal growth, to be more flexible, more fulfilling, even more fun.
The idea that work was supposed to be fun is an idea that came with the baby boomers. They brought it to us, and I think they thought life was supposed to be fun, which was very different than their parents and preceding generations who saw life as duty and obligation. We bring to work and to life an excitement and enjoyment that enables us to do it longer and do it better.
In the past, you went to work typically in a hierarchy, in a bureaucratic hierarchy. You hoped to have that job for the rest of your life because it was hard to get jobs. Now we have a technological change, economic change, and so on, which is extremely rapid, and you create a project team. It does its job. You close the project team out. Everybody gets laid off or put onto some other work. So the idea of moving around, of not being in one job for a whole lifetime, is common today, and it is a much more flexible kind of economy. It's in some ways much more challenging for the individual, but in other ways it's much more interesting for the individual.
What you have with baby boomers is a kind of sense of excitement about life that distinguishes us a little bit from generations. I've been through about 6 different careers, and I'll go through 1 or 2 more before I'm done. And so you've got a certain sense of experimentation and variety in our lives that nobody else has been through before.
Remember, the boomers grew up believing that if you don't like something, you don't have to accept it. You can alter it, find a way around it. Many didn't like the straight-laced corporate environment and found ways to change it.
I think much more today, your job is your skills, and you take your skills from place to place. If you're not improving your skills, you're itchy and kind of yearning to learn and go somewhere else. If your company's not paying attention and training you, then you're in a situation where you have a very bad mismatch, which is probably going to mean you're going to move on.
When I grow up, I want to file all day.
I want to claw my way up to middle management.
I want to be underappreciated.
Be paid less for doing the same job.
I want to be forced into early retirement.
If the company you worked for couldn't accommodate your needs, you could always start your own business. The boomers have proved to be quite adept at creating new ways in which to work.
Hi, it's John. I know, it's a real bad time right now. Call Joe and tell him to get that stuff out of there. Well, we'd have to get an appraiser out there. Welcome to my office. My office can do what any corporate office can do. I've got phone, fax, high-speed internet, video. My morning commute, I usually grab a cup of coffee and walk down the driveway. It takes about 30 seconds. The kids, I think the kids they're just not quite sure about Dad. They just don't quite know what Dad does sometimes.
It's kind of weird, because an office shouldn't really be in a treehouse.
Treehouses are for kids and adults, and maybe for the kid and all the adults. I think my life's innovative. I think I've always just looked for different ways of doing things. I needed a place for an office and knew I was going to have to build something, and that's when Pete and Jake just kind of put the idea in my head.
My name is Pete Nelson, and I build tree houses for a small company owned by myself and Jake Jacob.
So many summer
People want tree houses for many, many reasons. The tree offers some form of protection from what, could be anything, but it is a place to go contemplate life.
Pete, I want to show you the carving table. It's a lot of fun. They're just waiting for the clickety-clack.
One of my favorite features in here is the carvings that one of our carpenters did.
Western red cedar trim throughout, and Douglas fir decking.
We did everything soup to nuts, right from breaking bark to the final nail. I think most of our clients like that tree houses are an idea that are outside of the box.
Perfect size deck.
They might be living in very comfortable situations, but a tree house gives them a sense of adventure right in their own backyard.
That's all you need.
The beauty of being an entrepreneur comes in many ways and fashions, and in my case, I tend to gravitate toward things that few other people are doing.
You're going to be impressed.
I do have to pinch myself now and then. It is amazing to me that we're just creating fun spaces like this. We're fulfilling boomer dreams with building our tree houses.
Baby boomers dream of being an astronaut or having a tree house, and it's hard to qualify to be an astronaut, but you can have a tree house.
The boomers' willingness to break rules and embrace change led to an unprecedented revolution in entrepreneurship.
There's been a direct line drawn sociologically and historically between the Haight-Ashbury and Silicon Valley. They're only 30 miles apart, but in spirit, they're very much the same, because they were both groups that didn't respect the old rules and that were creating new ways, new means, new methods. And I think the spirit of creativity and innovation and the entrepreneurial strengths of this generation relate to the fact that authority didn't have to be listened to, that you could think for yourself.
Baby boomers have been broadly quite entrepreneurial. It's not the vast majority of the group, but it's a very large portion of them.
Boomer workers brought an unprecedented level of innovation to their jobs. Hundreds, even thousands of new products were created that catered to a variety of tastes. And that changed what we wore, what we ate, and how we lived. Their ingenuity fueled the economic expansion of the last quarter of a century.
My definition of an entrepreneur is when everybody around you thinks you're crazy, but you still think you have a good idea and you act on it. And I think that's something that anybody can do.
Innovation, invention, discovery, freedom of ideas, higher education, they're still flocking here. I've had a lot of people that say, yeah, I can manufacture the goods in China or in India, but when I want to think of the new products, I want to come to the United States because they think outside the box.
As the boomers entered the workforce in the 1970s, another important development was taking place. Computers began to transform both the white-collar world and every aspect of our economy. We seized on this new technology to create the digital revolution. I was never very good at typing.
The electronic innovations that have been brought about mainly by the United States and mainly by baby boomers in the United States are probably the most important single set of mechanical and electronic, if you will, of scientific innovations that we've ever seen in the world. They have only begun really to change the world. I think the generations that follow us will see much more impact than we have, although the impact that we and the baby boomers have seen is absolutely enormous. That will possibly, in the long term, be viewed as the strongest legacy of the baby boomers.
We introduced one other dramatic addition to the workplace that may have altered our lives more than any other innovation.
I'm
sure that the biggest legacy of the baby boom generation will be the role that women assumed in this country, that they entered the workforce, that they took an equal place beside men everywhere. I graduated from college in 1968. I went to Smith. I went to an all-women's school. I went to it was a school that had very high academic standards and women who were achievement-oriented, certainly in academic pursuits. And yet the whole time we were there, the goal was to get married and have kids. But something happened because I graduated with women who had those expectations. And yet I and many women of my age wound up entering the business world and staying. I think we all entered. Entering was not the surprising thing. The staying part was the change.
Mary, I want you to be in charge out there on the floor tonight.
You want me to be in charge? But that's your job.
No, my job is telling you what your job is.
Oh, but
Look, if it's a question of extra money...
No, it's not a question of money.
Good, because there isn't any.